Hey everybody, Jokerfet here, back again with another video. So I wanted to make a video just kind of broadly explaining and talking about my feelings on the past 4 years of Star Wars since I was last active on YouTube, and catch you guys up to speed with my thoughts and feelings on the franchise. And obviously it's been a very important and divisive past 4 years of Star Wars content. So I guess I'll start off with the big important question: do you still love Star Wars? Yes, I still love Star Wars. Nothing about my love of Star Wars has changed in the past 4 years, even though I'm not as much of a collector as I once was. The franchise obviously still means so much to me, and nothing about that has changed. The second big question is, do you like the Disney Star Wars films? Yes, I do like the Disney Star Wars films quite a lot, actually. I think that the majority of them have been pretty great, and even the ones that I don't love as much, I still think are really good movies, and movies that I'm more inclined to return to than I would say the vast majority of movies that I see. So those are just the two big questions out of the way, and we can kind of get into, I guess, some of the more nitty gritty, some of the more details about it. And I guess I'll just kind of pick up where I left off back in 2016. So in 2016, when I stopped making videos for 4 years, we were coming off the high of The Force Awakens, which was an absolutely amazing time to be a Star Wars fan. And I think that many of you guys who watched me back then and just who were Star Wars fans in 2015 and 16 would agree that that was some great time to be a Star Wars fan. Everybody was so excited for The Force Awakens, and it came out and it was a very good quality film. Obviously, comparing it to the prequel trilogy, a higher caliber of acting, I would say, especially a higher caliber of writing. And everybody was really hot on Force Awakens when that came out, and the time after that, the next year, 2016, which I actually stopped making videos in August of that year, but in December we got Rogue One, which only just further added to the kind of love for this new era of Star Wars, I think. And Rogue One, I think that Disney, and well, let's not generalize here, Gareth Edwards succeeded in making an original trilogy Star Wars film separate from the original trilogy, which is really just a crazy thing to think about, that he succeeded so well at making a movie that blends and interfaces with the original trilogy in such a way, without it actually being from that era or made by the same people that the original trilogy was made by. So 2015 and 16, everybody was loving the direction that Star Wars was going under Disney. And then 2017 hits, and The Last Jedi releases, and it's a very divisive film. Obviously, I don't have to tell you guys about that if you're watching my channel. And a lot of people were upset at that movie because I think, without doing an in-depth critique slash evaluation of The Last Jedi, that would be a video unto itself. And trust me, many people have made videos like that. I've seen some of them. I mainly try and stay away from those long form critique videos because I don't feel that my experience is enriched having seen those. And I think a lot of people were unhappy with the direction that they took Luke Skywalker. I think that was the biggest thing with The Last Jedi that I noticed, at least. Again, not being someone who delves deeply into the critique videos or the here's my very long blog post on everything I hate about Last Jedi and why Rian Johnson sucks. And yeah, it divides fans a lot. And then it seems like after that, the next couple years, we have a very divisive fan community. Solo comes out, which is a movie that I actually love. I love Solo. I know that I'm kind of alone in that, I guess. Solo is not a movie that gets a lot of attention in the Star Wars community, but I absolutely love Solo, and part of that is because I'm a really big fan of the scum and villainy side of Star Wars. But getting off topic there, Solo underperforms at the box office, I think, in large part and due to franchise fatigue and just coming out at a bad time. It underperforms. And then fall 2019, I think we get like a really kind of like opposite ends of the spectrum in terms of fan reactions. Um, fall 2019, with the release of Fallen Order and The Mandalorian, it's like everybody was back into positive Star Wars mode again, and it was great. We had like a good couple months there where everybody was like, I think I actually really like Star Wars again. Fallen Order was a really good game, and Mandalorian is doing some great things for Star Wars. And then Rise of Skywalker comes out, and then the Star Wars fandom is back to being a divided mess again. Um, so that was like my synopsis on the fandom in the past 4 years. And it's really hard to talk about the Disney Star Wars era without talking about the fandom. And I get that everybody's entitled to an opinion to like or not to like something. And I'm not saying that that anybody who doesn't like the Star Wars films the Disney Star Wars films isn't entitled to that opinion. However, I think that a lot of fans can lose perspective. And I think that we live in an era where everybody has to have extreme opinions for their opinion to matter. At least that's how society perceives it. You either really really like something or you really really dislike something. So I don't think that that helps. And a lot of people kind of lose sight of the fact that the new Star Wars films aren't necessarily for you. Obviously, Star Wars has always had a cross generational appeal, but people who are saying that oh, this ruined Star Wars is dead and stuff, they're like, when you're seeing a movie and like you're seething in rage at it, sitting right next to you in the theater is going to be some young kid who's the same age that you were when you first saw Star Wars, and they're going to grow up loving this. Like, some kids nowadays are going to grow up and The Last Jedi is going to be their favorite Star Wars film. It's going to be like their Empire Strikes Back. And I think a lot of people lose perspective when it comes to that. And I think that especially in the modern day, fandom is kind of cyclical, depending on like the ages of fans and old fans leaving and new fans coming in. Because also around the same time that we're seeing this kind of sequel bashing come into popularity, we've got like a resurgence in popularity of the prequels, where people are kind of like lauding it as like being like, oh, the prequels were great, is George Lucas's like unfiltered vision. Disney is like washed down his vision and sullied it. And I think that's great. Because as somebody that grew up during the prequels, as a kid, obviously I loved the films, and then growing up into like a teenager and a young adult, exposed to a lot of people on the internet just bashing the movies that I loved as a kid. And because of that, I think I kind of distanced myself a bit from them. Obviously, I still love them, and I still love them today. But now we're in this era where I guess people my age are now growing up, and we're starting to become, I guess, kind of like the new majority of Star Wars fans. And the prequels are loved again. And now the sequels are getting hated on. And so I think that it's going to be very cyclical, what we're going to see in the Star Wars fandom. I think that in another 20 years, the sequel trilogy is going to be in the exact same position the prequels are now, where the sequels are going to go through like a good decade of getting dumped on for this or that reason. And then when the kids who grew up with the sequel trilogy are young adults, then it's going to see a resurgence in popularity. And then whatever is the new Star Wars at that time is going to go through the same thing, same thing. And I think that that just has to do with fandom expectations. You're always going to love the Star Wars you grew up with more, I think, than anything new. Because if it's new, like, especially like with my experience with the prequels, growing up with the prequels, original trilogy fans are like, no, this isn't my Star Wars. This is ruined Star Wars. But growing up with the prequels are just Star Wars to me. I didn't have any other vision in my head as to how Darth Vader was when he was Anakin Skywalker, or how he and Padme met, or what the Clone Wars were. Um, Growing up, the prequels was just Star Wars. It wasn't like, oh, it's like that's not my version of Star Wars. My version of Star Wars is just the original trilogy. So the group of kids growing up with the sequels now, that's just going to be their Star Wars. And for the people that are like, no, this isn't my Star Wars, like if it's not written by George Lucas, it's not Star Wars. They're just going to age out. And the new majority of people are going to be people that grew up with the sequels, and it's just going to be their Star Wars. So that's pretty much what I want to say about the fandom and the fandom reaction to the Disney films. Again, everyone's entitled to their own opinion. I'm not making this video to try and stoke nerd rage on the internet. If you like the sequels or if you don't like the sequels, I'm happy for you. I personally like the sequels, and if you don't, that's great too. Everybody can have an opinion, and everybody can voice criticisms. And hopefully from this, we'll get more Star Wars that everybody can kind of come in together and enjoy. So with that bit on the fandom out of the way, I actually want to get into my feelings, my personal feelings on the Disney era of Star Wars. So I will go ahead and say that the sequel trilogy did not go in the direction that I wanted it to. And I knew that from the very beginning of it, from The Force Awakens. While I know The Force Awakens is a very well made movie, the story is not what I want it to be. And the story of The Force Awakens set us up for a very similar experience to the original trilogy, which is not what I wanted going into this. Obviously, we knew that there would be some kind of Imperial element just from like the teaser trailer and seeing their stormtroopers and stuff. But I was hoping going into it that they would just be a faction and that we would get something else as the main antagonist. Obviously, that didn't happen. We ended up getting the First Order and essentially a repeat of Empire versus Rebels. So, with that in mind, I still think that the sequel trilogy came out really good. The Force Awakens, very well made movie, even if it does repeat a lot of the same ideas and plot beats from A New Hope. The Last Jedi, I thought, is probably the most interesting movie of the trilogy because the ideas it puts forward. And I think that had Rian Johnson just been the sole person in charge of the sequel trilogy, then we would have gotten a very different trilogy, and probably one that was more consistent and one that deviated further from the original trilogy. Because I think the ideas in The Last Jedi are far more interesting than the ones in The Force Awakens. Because in The Last Jedi, Rian Johnson is kind of challenging the idea of what Star Wars is and what Star Wars could be. And specifically a lot through both the characters of Luke Skywalker and Kylo Ren. As I addressed earlier, a lot of people were upset with the direction that Rian took Luke in, but I thought it was extremely compelling and very well acted by Mark Hamill. And also just very relatable. We see Luke as this broken down old man who, although, yes, at one time he had a great victory when he redeemed his father, which led to the destruction of the Emperor, the first destruction of the Emperor, and the collapse of the Empire. But he's a man that's kind of haunted by that victory, that because of that, people have put somewhat unrealistic expectations upon him, and he feels that because of that, he failed Ben Solo, and that's why Ben Solo fell to the dark side. And so he feels that the only way that he can really exist is away from everything, because he feels like he's gonna mess it up again. And that's a very like relatable, down to earth portrayal of a character that's essentially a superhero, um, and one that I found incredibly interesting. And with Kylo Ren in that movie, we see a character that's not pure evil, but one who is struggling with the light and the dark, and who just wants to kind of just honestly is kind of like speaking as someone almost outside the movie, and it says like, yeah, let the past die, like let's get rid of all this original trilogy stuff, the Empire and the Rebels, the Jedi, everything, you know, we don't need it to go forward. We can exist without it. So I think that The Last Jedi has the most interesting ideas of the trilogy, and it suffers, unfortunately, from being the middle movie in a trilogy that Rian Johnson neither started nor finished. So he kind of had to backpedal those ideas at the end of the film and almost reset to a status quo, which I thought was very unfortunate. I think that The Last Jedi is a very interesting movie until like the very end of it, where they kind of backpedal all the arguments that Ryan has been putting forth. Um, like, and the idea that the Jedi do not have the sole right to the light side of the Force, that there could be a better, different way in the future that doesn't just involve this cycle of destruction between the light and the dark sides. Um, so yeah, Last Jedi I really really liked, and probably in terms of just a raw like fresh out of the theater impression, The Last Jedi is the movie that I had the most like very positive reaction to. Like after seeing The Last Jedi, I was like, that might be the best like Star Wars movie I've seen in theaters. Like wow, I was just amazed by it at the time. And obviously my opinions have kind of cooled since then. I never uh, I never share an opinion on a Star Wars movie if I've only seen it once. I have to have repeat viewings to really solidify my stance and settle down and see what I think about it with a bit more perspective. And then that brings us to The Rise of Skywalker, which I think with my expectations set by the end of Last Jedi, and with the perspective of this trilogy and just the previous two installments, I was like, okay, I know that with JJ that we are going to have a very kind of nostalgic, traditional Star Wars third film. That we're going to have one that has strong echoes of the original trilogy, and has a archetypal good versus evil um, philosophy at the center of it. And with that expectation, I went in. I got that, and I thought it was great. Obviously, I think that there were some pacing issues with the film, some story beats that I thought could have used some more time. I thought that I don't know how much footage they shot, but if they had given that movie like an Avengers Endgame runtime of 3 hours, I would have been totally fine with it, just to give some of the plot lines some more space to breathe and to explain things more. Um, and in terms of some of the overall plot points that I guess were most divisive about The Rise of Skywalker, namely the return of Palpatine and the revelation that Rey is a Palpatine, I was very fine with both of those. Obviously, Rise of Skywalker had some strong Dark Empire plot similarities going on, and Dark Empire is not the most popular expanded universe story, but I actually really like it. I think that it encapsulates some of the most zany fun that the old expanded universe had in it. So I was fine with the return of Palpatine and the revelation that he was the puppet master behind the First Order, because it also kind of gives some it gave some meaning, I guess I felt, to the First Order that I didn't have before, because just based off Force Awakens and The Last Jedi, I was still like, man, like, why are these guys just trying to be the Empire again? From an in-universe perspective. Obviously, from out-of-universe, they want to have stormtroopers in it because people know stormtroopers, people like stormtroopers. But from an in-universe perspective, it's like, why the Empire again? And the revelation that, oh, it's Palpatine trying to actually bring the Empire back, stronger than it ever was before, with the Final Order, that made the First Order make sense to me. So that made me like the First Order a lot more, knowing that essentially they were the first wave in a planned resurgence of the Empire. So that I was totally fine with that, and it made me like the First Order more. It made me like the overall bad guys of the films more. Rey Palpatine. Some people really liked Rey as a nobody. The Star Wars channel, Star Wars Explained, comes to mind. Makes great videos. I love his videos. But he was not hot on Rise of Skywalker because he was a big fan of Rey as a nobody. And I get that and I understand that. But also a part of me, the Skywalker saga has always been about kind of legacy and about family legacy. And Rey being a Palpatine just kind of reinforces that and kind of brings it together for me. Because in the Skywalker saga, this last trilogy, the sequel trilogy, we have not actually had a Skywalker as the protagonist, which kind of almost at the time makes you feel like, okay, is this really part of this saga if there's not a Skywalker as the protagonist? Obviously, we have Kylo Ren, we have Ben Solo, who carries that blood, but he's not a Skywalker in really any sense. And so, Rey being a Palpatine, it kind of just ties it together for me. Because then, especially at the end where you have her choosing to be a Skywalker, that I think symbolically connects the sequel trilogy to the other films. So I know that's kind of a weird line of thinking when it comes to that, but I was totally fine with Rey as a Palpatine, and I think that it fits very well with the overall theme of the sequel trilogies of who you start as doesn't have to be who you end as. So Rey starts as a nobody, ends as a Skywalker. Kylo starts as a villain and ends redeemed. Finn starts as a stormtrooper and ends up a hero of the Resistance. And so I think that it has a very that tone, that moral throughout the sequel trilogy is very strong, I think. So when we take a step back and look at the sequel trilogy as a whole, we have 3 films that I really, really like, that do kind of form a bit of a disjointed trilogy. There's no looking past that. There's definitely certain plot points that JJ set up in The Force Awakens that Ryan chose to kind of sidestep in The Last Jedi, that when JJ came back in Rise of Skywalker, he kind of just picked them back up again from where he left them in The Force Awakens, kind of jumping over some of Ryan's plot lines. And there's no ignoring that. It does feel disjointed at parts. However, with it being a disjointed trilogy that lacked an overarching kind of like writer, I think it turned out as well as it could have, to be honest. I do think, again, that if Ryan had just made the trilogy, that it would have been a very different feeling trilogy that would have deviated more from the original trilogy. And I would have really liked to see that. And also, if JJ had directed the entire trilogy, I think that it would have been more traditional, in line with people's expectations, I guess, as to the portrayal of Luke, at least. And it would have been a very nostalgic trilogy that with a lot of callbacks, that probably would have been, at the very least, more tonally consistent. So, stepping back from it, again, my thoughts and feelings on the sequel trilogy is I really like it. I think that the films are very well made, and the acting is, frankly, some of the best that we've ever seen in the franchise. Adam Driver as Kylo Ren slash Ben Solo is fantastic. Adam Driver absolutely kills it in each movie, in every scene that Kylo Ren is in. Um, he is honestly the reason to watch the entire trilogy. His performance is just so strong. You can see the torn, conflicted emotions within him. That really, he is everything that we kind of got with Episode 3 Anakin, but just on a different caliber, to be honest. And the supporting cast is phenomenal. Also, Daisy Ridley, obviously. I can't skip Daisy Ridley. She's very, very good in the films as well. The supporting cast is all very strong. Oscar Isaac and John Boyega are standouts, and the legacy characters each I think give just great performances. Harrison Ford in The Force Awakens was much better than I had feared that he wouldn't be, especially after seeing Indiana Jones 4. I thought that he really brought Han Solo back in a way that I wasn't expecting, or I feared that he wouldn't. Mark Hamill, despite his public disagreements with the direction that Luke Skywalker went in, he absolutely gave it his all with that performance. And I think that because of it, we got an extremely unexpected but very empathetic, very realistic portrayal of Luke that I did not expect and that I was very pleased with. And Carrie Fisher, obviously, she did not get a chance to do as much in the trilogy as any of us would have hoped due to her unfortunate, untimely passing. But she was still a delight to watch in the films and really brought that spirit of Leia back, and had not lost a single step. Like, just really channeled the character again. And so all the legacy characters were great. So I thought that really the performances of the sequel trilogy help elevate it to something that I really just want to revisit. Um, so yeah, the sequel trilogy, like I said, revisiting kind of what I started this segment on. Story wise, did not go the direction that I had wanted it to. I wanted something that was not the Empire and the Rebels again. But with that being the case, and with what we got, I thought it delivered very well on three very enjoyable films. And to take a step back and talk about the fandom again, I have never understood the argument that somehow these new films invalidate the Star Wars that has come before, and even like outside of the films, that somehow this diminishes the novels from the old expanded universe or any other way. Maybe it's just the way that I am able to look at it, and maybe it's kind of a blessing that I'm able to look at it this way. But the sequel trilogy and like the Thrawn trilogy from the old expanded universe, the sequel trilogy does not invalidate the Thrawn trilogy for me. And I'm not saying that they obviously exist in the same like timeline. It's that they're just different versions of sequels, right? While the sequel trilogy might be the canon, the old Legends continuity is still just as valid for me. I can still go back and revisit Legends stories with just as much enjoyment as I had before. It's just we have different stories now that also depict a different version of where these characters went after the events of the original trilogy. So for me, it's not a big issue that somehow other Star Wars material is invalidated by the recent films. So maybe that's just my ability to look at it and not other people's. And I'm sorry if you do feel that these movies have somehow invalidated stories that you love. Um, that's just how I look at it. So, just kind of, I guess, to wrap this up, because it has already been a very long video as I watch the time on it. Yeah, that's kind of my feelings on the past 4 years of Star Wars. Overall, I've really enjoyed it, and I've thought that it's really sad how the Star Wars community is kind of ripping itself apart over these films. And maybe I was just too young at the time of the prequels release to really understand or see this same level of divisiveness. But you know, it makes me miss those times in the Star Wars community where we were just all excited together for more Star Wars, and there wasn't the same level of dread or apprehension or distrust of Disney that we do see now. So, if anything, I think that the actual Star Wars material is in a very good place. We have the saga is now concluded. We have some very promising Disney Plus television shows coming up. The High Republic, I'm very excited to read all the material that comes out about that. So the Star Wars material itself, I think, is in a very good spot. It's just the Star Wars community and the Star Wars fandom that is really in a tragic, unfortunate place right now, in my opinion. So again, I didn't make this video to critique anyone's opinions on Disney Star Wars. If you don't like it, that's good. That's fine. You know, I'm not trying to argue with you. I think that arguing on the internet is kind of a waste of time. So I just don't engage with stuff like that. It's just I wanted to give you all my kind of freeform thoughts on the Disney Star Wars and specifically the sequel trilogy. I could make whole separate videos on Rogue One and Solo and The Mandalorian, and I just might do that sometime. But anyway, if you've watched this long, these past 32 minutes of me rambling on about Star Wars, thanks for sticking with me. Hopefully you enjoyed listening to me talking about it, or at least found it interesting, and I'd love to engage with you down in the comments below and tell me what you think about Disney Star Wars and the sequel trilogy and just kind of the state of the Star Wars community in general. And I'd like to have a good civil discussion with people down in the comments below. Again, I'm not trying to debate the movies or listen to an argument as to why such and such is bad and such is actually good. I just enjoy good-natured conversation and discussion. So, yeah, again, thank you for watching this video or listening to it, and may the Force be with you.